So today we're going to talk about value takers versus value creators, and how, depending on how society is set up, they can be easily confused for one another, and how this confusion actually leads to the downfall of different civilizations. So this paradigm was first articulated, at least to me, by Naval on the Joe Rogan podcast. In one of his, I think maybe his first Joe Rogan interview, he talked about this different categories of human being and how they operate in society. So you have people that are symbiotes. That is, they are largely not adding a lot of value, but not really taking a lot of value, but are still sort of necessary for things to to continue. And then you, of course, have people that are adding a lot of value, that are creating a lot of value, which is sort of what the majority of progress, development, innovation in human history is built on. And then, of course, you have parasites. You have people that simply exist in a mode where they're drawing more value than they're giving back from the society. And these people have always existed. And they are generally a smaller percentage of the population, but whenever they get too large of a percentage, because your society is set up to reward these kinds of people, or you're not kicking them out and drawing proper boundaries around them and their behavior, then the civilization collapses, right? And so you've got symbiotes, you've got contributors, and you've got parasites, and these are sort of three main modes that you see not only in human beings, but also in the natural world, in biology, right? All these plants, all these animals all around me, are doing various degrees of these things. Most of them are relatively symbiotic. They're living in harmony, or at least relative harmony, with the other things around them. There's some competition going on, but it's not overly aggressive. And then there are some that are extremely parasitic. I think of like a strangling vine, or a weed that comes in and just sort of takes over the entire landscape. These are things that sort of thrive by their ability to destroy other parts of the ecosystem. And then, of course, there are contributors. There are sort of keystone species, right? Like a large tree that's supporting the undergrowth underneath and keeping the soil intact, and used for the animals to live in, and things like this. And so these are three main categories of ways of being in the world. And how do they get confused? Well, I said earlier that if they get confused, that's actually one of the better ways that you can end up getting rid of your civilization, because in a way it doesn't make sense that there could be a situation where the parasites begin to overwhelm the value contributors and the symbiotes, unless they were being confused as such, right? Because we have natural born instincts to assess value. It's actually very deep in us. We understand reciprocity on a very deep level, and we can very quickly suss out whether someone is carrying their weight, or whether someone is actually pulling resources away from other people and not contributing back. It's very important for our survival, both as individuals as well as back when we were living in tribes, to have a very keen understanding of whether or not the people around us were contributing properly, or at least trying to contribute properly. And so, how do these get confused? Well, the primary way that this confusion takes place is by misallocation or misunderstanding of capturing value versus generating value. All right, so what do I mean by capturing value? Well, in Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, he talks about how successful startups and successful corporations are actually not necessarily the result of creating tons of value. And he uses the example of scientists to sort of pick on them a little bit. He says, look, scientists always have this illusion. They have this illusion that the value that they create in the world will be properly rewarded. That is, if I go out and I discover some new theory or some new principle in physics or biology or mathematics, that my contributions will result in me being rewarded properly, right? With fame, with recognition, maybe even material rewards. And this fallacy leads them to not setting themselves up properly to actually capture the value that they create. And the same thing happens in business. You can have a business that creates tons and tons and tons of value, right? But if they're not actually capturing a significant percentage of that value, then the rewards that come about, individually as well as to the organization become sort of paltry. You can think of this in terms of an industry that has a very high amount of revenue, a very high amount of traffic, but isn't actually able to capture a high amount of profit. The classic version of this is the airline industry. Airlines historically are terrible at making profits, but of course they're kind of necessary, and they're very large, very capital intensive, infrastructure intensive operations, and so they generate a lot of revenue, but they actually capture a very small amount of that revenue as profit, and as a result they're actually not very it's not a very good industry to be in. It's not a very profitable business, right? What makes a successful startup is being able to capture a large percentage of the value that you create. Okay, so how does this relate back to our trichotomy between contributors, symbiotes, and parasites? Well, parasites get confused as contributors when the judgment that society places on someone's worth or someone's investability, right, or someone's value, for lack of a better term, is a product of the value that they capture rather than purely the value that they create. And of course you can see how this is confusing, because didn't I just say earlier that capturing a lot of the value that you create is actually very important. It's very essential for you to take care of your business, for you to take care of yourself, for you to take care of others. You have to capture a good percentage of that value. And you might also say, well, from an economic standpoint, it doesn't really make sense that we would consider an individual or an organization that isn't able to capture a good percentage of the value that they create actually extremely inefficient, right? Because why are you creating all this value and then not capturing any of it? That doesn't make any sense either. But again, you have to think about what's going on in the parasitic mode. So in the parasitic mode, you're not actually creating a lot of that value. You're actually skimming that value, or you're leeching that value out from other people. And so the result of this is that you accumulate resources, you accumulate value, you have the perception, the outside perception by others of being a contributor, or at least a node of value, right? At least a value attractor. And yet you're not actually contributing back to the society. And this is, the classic grifter phenomenon. We talk about how grifters are becoming more ubiquitous. Everything's a grift now. People, scammers are everywhere, yada, yada, yada. And yet, increasingly, our economic systems, our social media systems, our ruling, government systems are set up to not only allow, but even reward these people. And so if you get into a situation where the people that are not actually creating value, but are actually simply very good at capturing value, right? Capturing not a large percentage of the value that they create, but a large percentage of the value that's out there, or the large percentage of the value that's created by others. Then you start to get into this very, very dangerous territory where this mode of existence, this sort of ancient mode that all biological organisms have a certain percentage of being, and some are more than others, starts to take over. And worse, it becomes self-perpetuating, in that the more of them that there are, the more optimal and rational that strategy is for a given individual, right? You might look around and say, well, all these people are not really contributing much, but they're managing to capture a lot, and they're getting rewarded. They're getting rewarded with jobs, with opportunities, with investments, with mates. And what am I doing wrong? Well, what you're doing wrong is you're not playing by the rules of the system, which in this situation, in this scenario, are set up to reward the people that are really good at capturing the value, whether or not they actually created it. And so what to do in this situation? Well, it's a very difficult situation, because you can run into the problem of eventually this can become such a big issue that even the great contributors, even the ones who are creating a lot of the value, and even the ones who are creating a lot of that value and then being able to capture a good percentage of it, aren't able to compete. Because it's always easier to simply siphon value away from others, especially if your system is set up to allow that to happen, than it is to go out and go through the world and blaze a trail and create something very valuable, and then engineer a scenario where you're actually able to capture a significant amount of the value. That's like a way harder problem than just acting very parasitically. And so the danger and the reason why civilizations downfall is because over time, if they're not careful about controlling and expelling their parasitic elements, then actually those parasitic elements, as a rule, are going to outcompete even the best contributors. Say nothing of the symbiotes, right? So a symbiote in sort of the human ecosystem would be someone like let's say a janitor, right, or a home care worker, someone who's not creating a massive amount of value, but they're still necessary for the system to keep going and for things to move along. They're necessary as maintenance. And so what is the key takeaway? Well, the key takeaway is that if you don't control these parasitic elements, then actually you run into this doomsday scenario where even the value contributors are not able to compete. And over time, this creates a feedback loop where every individual is actually incentivized and rationally incentivized to defect from creating value and to move further in the direction of simply extracting value. And so we have to think very carefully about which of these categories people around us are operating in and which of these categories we're rewarding. Are we giving a lot of material, financial, career, mating opportunities to people that are simply extracting value? Or are we giving them to people that are contributing, that are generating a lot of value, and then clever enough to figure out a good way to capture that value? I argue that we have to be putting all of our emphasis and all of our policy and ideas and rules about business and law around rewarding the latter and punishing the former. And if we don't do that, everything falls apart.